So thank you, everybody. This panel is about cheap access to space. And you can read the purpose of cheap access to space, but to me and for the Space Frontier Foundation and much of this community, cheap access to space is the holy grail. With cheap access to space, we open the solar system to human civilization. Without it, they continue to be dreams. There's all kinds of aspects to cheap access to space. Hopefully we'll get into some of those. Economic growth, national security, a variety, lots of other benefits. But we have a great panel today sponsored by Vulcan Aerospace to get into some of these questions. So this is what we're gonna do. We're not gonna have any presentations. There's gonna be no charts from the panelists. We're gonna have dig into a series of questions, hopefully have an interactive discussion among the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to ask some questions. So I want to briefly introduce the members of the panel. First, Chuck Beams. Chuck is the president of Vulcan Aerospace. His job there is to execute the strategic plan of Paul and implement Paul Allen's vision. He has a lot of his experience. Before that, he was the principal director of Space and Intelligence for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, where he managed a $90 billion portfolio. So he's used to many billions of dollars managing that, so maybe that's why Paul hired him. He's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. He's worked on Capitol Hill. He has a lot of deep expertise in the space industry that he brings to his job. Laetitia, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. Impossible to pronounce. Can I just say Laetitia Garriott? Garriott. Okay. So co-founder and president of Escape Dynamics. Her company you just heard is using power beaming to break through the rocket equation to bring single stage to orbit into reality. She has a 15-year career in Wall Street, including Goldman Sachs. She's on the Council of Foreign Relations, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and she's on the board of the National Museum of Mathematics. Jay Gibson is the president of XCore. He's had many previous roles in companies and CFO, managing director, and chief operating officer. And he's the chairman of the board of advisors for Looking Glass Investments. And then the last, Jason Andrews. Jason here is the CEO of Spaceflight Industries. He's had a couple decades of experience. He looks young, but he's actually got, maybe he dyes his hair. But he's had a couple decades of experience in this industry. He previously was worked at Kistler Aerospace, then many startups, NewSpace. So he's a serial space entrepreneur, lots of experience and insights in this area. And he actually has, in some ways, more insights and knowledge and lesson learned than all of us, because he's really a second-generation space entrepreneur. And then finally, we have on the far part of the couch is Dr. Jerome Pearson, who's the president of Star Technology, who has a company building reusable, cheap access in space transportation called EDDI, using electrodynamic tethers, which pushes against the magnetic field and has effectively infinite ISP. Dr. Pearson has a long experience with tethers and was the former chief of structural dynamics branch at the Air Force Research Laboratory. So I'm going to open up the questions. The first question we'll just start with Chuck and go down and have everyone, each of them. We'll have a series of questions. We'll have a more interactive discussion. So the opening question for our panelists, and this goes to Chuck first, is what do you see as the primary barrier to achieving cheap access to space, or CATS, and what is your proposed solution to that barrier?
Hi. First, thanks for running this panel and all that kind of stuff. I think we've got a great group of folks here to kind of bounce ideas off each other and hopefully field some really great questions from the audience. I'm going to, just for a second, kind of the answer to that question is really why Vulcan Aerospace exists, frankly. And the simple answer to that is that there needs to be more competition, frankly. And one of the reasons why space launch was born out of government programs, because it was incredibly hard, incredibly capital intensive. And so, and that's the right way to go. But inherent in government programs, even if they're competed at the onset, there's really no natural, continuous competitive environment for them. And so, and we all know as red-blooded American proponents of capitalism that competition is probably the best way to continuously get better, faster, cheaper. You see the revolution occurred in the computer industry when we went from just a handful of banks and government using computers, right, the big, and universities, to the consumer electronics thing. And that's really when it became a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, but it really took off. So what we believe is the equivalent kind of situation exists for low Earth orbit, where if we get the cost down, then more people will want access to space for more entrepreneurial activities. And then when that occurs, the demand for launch will continue to go up. And what will happen is it'll be able to sustain more launch providers. And more launch providers means more competition. And that's how we get to a much cheaper access to space. And so that's really, in a sense, is the vision of Vulcan Aerospace. And there's really kind of two parts to that. We have the stratolaunch aircraft and the whole future for that, and we'll be announcing a lot more later this year about where that's going to go into the future. But the other side of it is we are looking at and making specific investments in companies that are interested in entrepreneurial companies that close a business case without government funds. If they're able to also win government contracts, that's great. That's gravy. But what we're really interested in doing is fostering an economy that is truly commercial, and because we believe that when that fire is ignited, then the demand for launch will go through the roof, and there'll be lots. It won't just be Vulcan. There'll be lots of folks building launch vehicles and all that.
Great. Laetitia.
So I'm completely with Chuck on the fact that competition here is a key answer to this. I would add that we need to have a wider lens over what methods are used to achieve low cost of access to space. For 50 years, we've been solely focused on chemical propulsion. I think reusability is the holy grail, for sure. I would argue that reusable single stage to orbit is the ultimate holy grail. And so expanding, and it's great to be pursuing reusability with chemical launcher. I think we need to be looking at externally powered space launch and microwave powered propulsion as well. And so we're just making it happen. And so as Chuck said, let the industry make it happen.
Cool. Well, thanks, Charles. Yeah, I guess I'm a little older than I look, thanks to my mom's genes. But anyway, that has allowed me the opportunity to actually work at a couple launch vehicle companies, starting off with Kistler Aerospace Corporation back in the 90s. It was a two-stage reusable system using LOX kerosene NK-33 engines. And reusability was the key. We were trying to revolutionize the price to orbit. I think we've been at it for decades. And reusability is the key, and I do agree with the rocket equation. Once you solve a reusability, then you got to solve how do I get to higher ISP. And at some point, that definitely goes beyond chemical propulsion. I think the other way to solve the problem, going back to Chuck's point, is supply and demand. After working at Kistler and then starting my first company, NewSpace, we've worked on 6 or 7 or 8 launch vehicle programs as a prime contractor. None of them really made it to orbit because they all got canceled before. There were government programs that got canceled when new administrations came in. So after banging my head against that wall for 10 years, I decided to flip from the supply side of the equation to the demand side of the equation. And I think that is key. When we went out and started Spaceflight, it was about, hey, we don't own vehicles. What we're going to do is go buy excess capacity on everybody else's launch vehicle. And so we're vehicle agnostic. And so I think there's technology solutions to this problem, but there's also business model solutions to this problem. Because suddenly when there is a robust commercial market and we separate the launch vehicle builders and operators from the service providers, which is what we do in the airline industry. If anyone recalls, up until about the 20s or 30s, people built their airplanes and they operated their airplanes. And ultimately, United Airlines came about because of an antitrust thing between Boeing. Boeing owned United Airlines and United Technologies, and they were forced to break all three apart because they dominated the market. And so that's what I'm really excited about is when you start seeing true space lines where they're operating on multiple vehicles, really understanding the customer's requirements and then turning that around to the host of infrastructure developers and say, here's my solution. I don't need a 3,000 kilogram rocket. I need a 300 kilogram rocket, and I need it at this price point. I think that's when we really have true breakthrough, because then we're really focused on market demand, which is going to allow everything to grow. So that's my input.
Thanks, Charles. The first thing is I might take exception with the term cheaper. I think we'd probably like to refer to it as more inexpensive or affordable, maybe is the way to look at it. I'd say in addition, there's a lot of commonality in what's already been said. Obviously the technology that allows you to get there, I think is a challenge for everybody at this point. But part of what allows the technology to get there is what's already been described. So you have a critical mass in the market that is saying, I believe there's a market here, and we're willing to invest funds to develop this technology. And it's more than just one company. It's a lot of companies working together to get there. The other is there has to be a critical mass in the business community that says we're willing to invest there and we believe there's a market. And then a general public that's willing to embrace the concept. The exciting thing is I think we're getting to all those areas. You're starting to see the indicators that the investing community, the institutional investors are coming in. The public's beginning to accept that, yes, this is going to be a market, no different than general aviation was 100 years ago. And now we're just going to get there. So all the signs can help us achieve these things that we need to get to less expensive and more affordable, I think are beginning to happen. As Jason said, what we're particularly doing to address this is we are moving exactly in that direction. We believe that with engines that are high frequency, low service, highly reusable, then they drive the affordable platform that delivers the mission. In our particular case, we truly see our mission profile and where we're going exactly what Jason described is we're just simply a platform to deliver the missions to the profile. And whatever the free market chooses to do with that, that's up to them. We are just the platform, we put it up there, and then we open it up, let that creative free market flow and say, there you go. And if we can create a business model after that, which we believe we can, then there you go, we're that viable platform in the market that starts to be part of the bigger picture that makes this all possible.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Charles, for inviting me to be on this panel. I come from a slightly different background, I think, than most of the other panelists. I've been stuck in my head in the clouds for a long time, theoretical ideas and so forth. I started at the space elevator end of things, worked on several designs for space elevators and so forth. And then I finally worked my way down to the short tethers like Joe Carroll was working on, and went from there. But I've always felt that NASA has been remiss in not putting more emphasis on non-rocket methods for getting access to space. I was really excited by the paper that Laetitia gave earlier, and that on the externally powered microwave spacecraft is really good. But there are other concepts out there that I don't understand why NASA hasn't pursued. For instance, there's the space elevators There's a low-altitude space elevator, Birch's orbital ring, and there's also a Keith Lostrom's launch loop. And I was hoping that NASA would put a little emphasis on that, because these are really promising in terms of getting a lot cheaper access to space than rockets. But there's been no progress. So I wish you well, Laetitia, in getting more interest in getting something going in the externally powered rocket. Now, in the meantime, we're looking at a small niche of the cheap access to space, and that is a lot of small satellites, CubeSats and so forth are being launched on the to the ISS now. And they're being released from the ISS, and they're going into orbit and doing quite a few interesting things. But the problem is the orbit's low, they decay pretty fast, and they can't go really above the ISS because of safety concerns. So what we would like to do is enable those small satellites, CubeSats and nanosats, to be able to access other orbits. And to do that, our Eddy spacecraft is an upper stage, propellantless, that can take them to other orbits. So we can take a spacecraft from the ISS, for instance, and take them to sun-synchronous orbit, which is otherwise unachievable to them. And we can also take secondary payloads, which would normally be limited to the orbit of the carrying vehicle, and take them from perhaps 28.5 degrees to any other orbit they want. And so we're looking at a cheap, propellantless upper stage that would really increase the capabilities for small sats and CubeSats.
Okay, great. And so is there, among any of the panelists, any interaction where you disagreed, want to comment on? So, you know, I've heard the attaboys. Or anything in any of the statements any of the other panelists made? Okay, let's move on. Some think that NASA or the Department of Defense should take a leadership role in helping the nation achieve the goal of cheap access to space. What do you think? If you think the U.S. government should have a role, what do you think they should do and not do? Open it up to the panel.
Is this working? Okay. I sort of feel like, I don't know who wrote that question, but this is like the dream question for me to answer. I think, just because it's coming from DOD, I think there's kind of, there's an answer in many parts, but I'll just focus on the one thing that I really believe is something that could be done, and it relates to a letter that a bunch of us signed to the Undersecretary, expressing our desire to engage more with the DOD, the sort of NewSpace launch related, and it's about the fact that there is a competitive commercial industry. In the next couple of years, it'll be very robust, in my opinion, sufficient where the DOD needs to look at their acquisition strategy less from a what do we need to develop and more of what do we actually just need. And that's for those that have been in that world, they would appreciate that there's a basic difference there, because these capabilities will exist. The DoD, for example, and NASA, I think could be in the same boat. They could look at it and say, we know we're going to need X, much like the way Jason runs the spaceflight services, where there's a payload, it needs to get to a certain orbit. How can we do that? But the government could do it basically bid it out. Instead of prescribing through a 1,000-page request for proposal, right? They could just sort of make it a very simple process, and at least I think they could do that. But what that would require is changing the way the DoD has done space launch for decades. They would have to break up. The big stuff is always going to be, at least for a very long time to come, is always going to need the big rockets to put it even into LEO. But as the DoD is going through their own re-architecting and disaggregation and all that for survivability and other reasons, a lot of these smaller payloads that need to go just into LEO, I think it's a very viable strategy. So we're pursuing that.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll jump in, and I guess as I've already said, first of all, I guess after 20 years in this industry, you can become a hardened cynic on a few topics, and this is probably one of them for me. Just because as you know, a young entrepreneur trying to make change and using government as a platform to do that, the government is great at seeding technology. I think they should continue to do that. But most people in the government pick a point solution, and it's usually engineers love of coming up with solutions in search of a problem instead of understanding what the problem is and working backwards. And so I think in general, there is a broad commercial ability for the commercial market to solve the space transportation problem. And the government should switch to buying services instead of rockets or even building their own rockets. So what you see right now is we actually can go to all the commercial launch vehicles on the planet and buy their excess capacity, but we can't go to the US government because the US government actually buys the whole rocket and they prescribe what goes. And so I think the government needs to switch to buying services and let the free market figure it out. Because it used to be, correct, that historically they were the biggest user of these capabilities, but that sea change has come to pass where now it's the commercial markets that's really driving the innovation, driving the space transportation requirements. So there are some good models. I think Cargo Logistics International Space Station was a great effort on the part of the government to take something that they've done historically and transition it to commercial activity, which, Charles, you were part of. And I think that's a great, doing crew transportation is a great template. And I think those are some of the models that should be pursued going forward.
Others?
I'll chime in. I think that one thing NASA could think about is trying to figure a way in their processes to adapt more to rapid development at startup and innovative companies, in the sense that the whole RFI, RFP process, et cetera, takes a lot of time. And so when you want to work with a center or you have to go through a Space Act agreement, et cetera, by the time you're close to negotiating it, if you had started the effort internally, you may be close to actually having it done yourself. And that whole time then has been wasted. And it's very difficult to plan 12 months in advance because programs have to change. We have to adapt as we identify things. And so I think some brainstorming around how to adapt to this rapid pace development at startup would be helpful. But they're doing a tremendous job in terms of allowing early stage company, I have to say, to tap into their resources at the various center. And so that this is something they definitely need to continue doing.
Great. Jay?
So perhaps I have a little bit different perspective. Charles didn't mention I held a leadership role at OSD and then also at the Air Force. And then I led several business units at Beechcraft, where part of what we did was sell products and services to both the United States government and to other governments abroad. I don't know if that makes me a cynic or not, but I will say that I think from my perspective, maybe a little different perspective, is as a business you have to decide what you're trying to achieve. With your technology and where you feel like the market is, in part of your strategy, do you want the government involved? That's a business decision. Just be prepared if you do, you've sold your soul. And that things will go in that direction.
Yes.
I think that I can just give you an example of how we look at it. I've met with leadership of the Air Force, and when we described our mission profile and what we could do, they said, wow, we'd be very interested in that. And my comment is we have no interest in doing business with you. Because if we start like a moth to the flame, start to follow you, to seek funding to help us evolve as a company, we'll look up one day and find out what we originally had thought was our business model and our mission that will be commercially viable has changed dramatically, and we're standing off in the wilderness when somebody totally unrelated has said this is no longer viable and the money's gone. My comment was we will be a successful company commercially, and when we do that, if our mission profile meets something you need, give me a call. And I will say that after the initial shock of my he said, well, in today's environment of better buying power and all the concept of buying commercially, that's actually where we prefer to go. But I think it's tough because I think we all reach, in the evolution of our business, we have business decisions that come about, and you have to make decisions that at the time with what you have. But it's, I think really Jason's comment about being a resource with the experience and the technology to seed would be ideal. Unfortunately, I'm afraid the personality of that user just doesn't allow for that.
So I want to get some interaction. So Jay, Jason, Laetitia, do any of you disagree with what Chuck said, that the government should try to buy services and get out of over-specifying, and that's how they give you that call later? They want to buy a service and they've set themselves up to do that. Do you a good thing for the government to go, but you're going to ignore them, maybe in your case, until they start doing that? Do you disagree with what Chuck said?
No, not at all. I think it's far more efficient to be a user than an owner. And the fee for service has been a concept that quite some time ago was born out of the fact as the budgetary resources to meet the original need of buy and execute yourself put pressure that they had to look at alternatives to provide that same mission, and that was to simply get a fee for service. They've been doing it in other areas for years, outsourcing. So I couldn't agree more.
Okay. Chuck?
I think this is what's interesting about what's going on and what the behavior that we're trying to encourage it, from on the investment side of Vulcan, this commercial thing, just as Jay just described, is that this is going to happen anyway. What I can see happening is much like when I was a lieutenant, there was a whole career field called communications, right? You had communication officers, you had enlisted, and they were real technicians, they were real communication engineers that actually had to design communication stuff for a base. This was base level kinds of things. But this was all before, forgive me, I'm even older than Jason. This was before the web, right, and all that. Before everybody communication was just sort of and before really wireless. And so that was a necessary thing for the military. But then the commercial side of it took off. And so anyway, so on a base you had a communications squadron. It was a regular military function. Guess what? Bases still have communication squadrons, but they've done away with the career. All that communication squadron does is procure services from 300 different companies right outside the base that provide that for businesses and everything in the surrounding community. And I can see if we all stay on the path that we're on, that's where launch is going to go, 10, 20 years from now, because we believe the commercial industry is just going to overtake it anyway. So one of the reasons why we were encouraged to write that letter was really, it wasn't pejorative as much as it was to open up the dialogue, to say, hey, we're here, we're coming. Why not have these conversations now so that in 2020 the government would really be able to take advantage, just the way Jay described. The government would be prepared to take advantage of these possibilities. So.
Great. Jason, you have something to add?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know if this one's on. Thank you. I think Jay's right. A little bit, if you're working with the government, there's pros and cons to it. And there's a certain personality associated with the government. And I think while their personality is to control the space transportation, and for reasons that of national security, they want to control it. But I think there's a sea change happening, and they're going to self-select services. And the reason is twofold. One is the procurement system's broke. So they just can't keep up with the rate of technology innovation, so they have to buy services. And second, there's going to be tremendous budget pressure. So they can't afford to keep doing what they've been doing. The budget will force them to actually adopt a new behavior. So I actually think it's going to end out well. It's just taken a long time to get here.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the next question. Are lower-cost launch vehicles a requirement to enable cheap access to orbit?
I'll jump in. I think there's a multi-stage answer to that. In the near term, yes, lower-cost space transportation methods, doesn't have to be launch vehicles, and business plans are key to enabling these new markets. You know, what we've done with Spaceflight is we don't build launch vehicles. We leave all that capital expense to somebody else. But what we've done is we break down, you know, it used to be if you wanted to launch a satellite, you bought a launch vehicle. We've now changed that, so that's no longer a requirement. And so now you can actually buy just a part of a launch vehicle. And so instead of paying tens of millions of dollars, you can pay $1 million or even hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a spacecraft to orbit. And while that is great, it's only part of the problem. I think as we go and want to continue to expand humanity into low Earth orbit and then beyond, you do need lower cost space transportation. I mean, we all know Elon's visions to go to Mars, and he's building the infrastructure to do that. And God bless him, quite frankly, because someone needs to do it. And it's not going to be the US government, might be China, but not our government. So yeah, you need to add the reusability, you need to go to higher ISP, and ultimately we need to push to get the cost down by an order of magnitude. What we see is we see some sweet spots. Ultimately, if you want to get people to space, it can't be $50 million for a seat to go to the ISS. It's got to be $5 million for a seat to get into low Earth orbit. And you're not going to do that with today's space transportation architectures. It's going to have to be something else.
If I understood your question, Charles, I think you were asking about the cost of the vehicle, right? Was it a needed requirement for cheap access to space?
That's one way you could take the question and answer it.
That's how I understood it. And I think that, of course, when you have, and if you reach full reusability, which I think people like Jay can comment is the ultimate goal of certain of the business models represented here, the cost of your vehicle becomes to some extent less relevant because you amortize it over, you know, so many flights. But I think it's still critical to have a lower cost vehicle, a low cost vehicle, because as we know, we will never prevent loss of vehicles, and the loss of a vehicle can be a major event for a company that only has 1 or 2 or 3 vehicles. And you don't want this to put that company out of business. At the time it just had a lot of loss of vehicle, it becomes the most difficult to turn back to investors and say, I need to be recapitalized right now.
So you have to be able to insure it.
So I think, and so low-cost insurance could, you know, solve some of this perhaps, but I think it depends where the insurance industry is. And in general, if we can evolve towards lower-cost vehicle, it's desirable.
Which is a business issue, no longer just a pure cost issue. Okay. Any other comments on that?
Yes. I've been in the aerospace business for quite a while, and back from the perspective of the Apollo program, when NASA had a goal of getting to the moon, and they came up with 3 different generations of launch vehicles to go through various stages of that, we thought we were going to be on Mars in the 80s. But happened, there was a continual push by NASA to get better, cheaper launch vehicles, and they went through a whole series of developments on various programs. The space shuttle was supposed to be a low-cost system. It didn't quite turn out to be that way, but they went through various iterations and vehicles that I was involved in. The National Aerospace plane, we did some high-temperature measurements and testing on the hot sections of that vehicle. That came to nothing.
But that was not a low-cost vehicle.
Well, no, it was going stage to orbit,
right?
And that was the holy grail at the time,
right?
And but that went by the way. And then there was the X-33 and other various variations on the space shuttle, Shuttle C, the Advanced Launch System, and all those. But there never has really been a working vehicle that has shown the promise that they were expecting. And I'm beginning to wonder if that, if there needs to be some kind of outside influence on that. Perhaps something like Laetitia's externally powered vehicle.
I was thinking you were thinking like an outside influence like Paul Allen.
Well, yes, that's another good outside influence. And maybe that's one way to go, to get some change there. But I think the NASA model so far has not been working on getting low-cost assets in space.
Other comments?
I did have one other thing I want to talk about. Again, looking at it from the investment side, there's cost, and I know that that's what the panel's about, is the cheap access to space and all that, but convenience is an important factor from this standpoint. if a startup company does its Series A, and part of their commitment through that round is to put, let's just say, for example, 2 satellites into orbit, and then they want to be able to show that they can do it to raise more capital, right, to grow their company. Well, if they have to wait 2 years to get a ride through because of the launch inconvenience, frankly, of like through a rideshare thing or something like that, and which is a tremendous service unto itself, then that company may go away in the process, right?
Right.
So convenience is a big part of the overall cost equation, but it's not just the launch vehicle, it's the cost to the company and the revenue generated. They're not able to generate revenue and raise money
Right.
quickly enough. And I see that a lot inside where I know
So-
Paul, like we bring different ideas, different projects to him for his consideration, and maybe it's just where he is in life, but he's more inclined to want to see some results before
Fast.
before he wants to invest externally. It's different for his own
Right.
project, and so I think that's an important convenience. Of course, now I'll give the shameless plug. Air launch, obviously, if you're able to get to where we want to go with airport style launch operations, we think that we'll be able to have a very rapid revisit, right, and be able to do a lot of launches quickly, and so there won't be this need to wait, launch above the weather, that kind of thing, so less likely to be weathered out, and that kind
Right.
of thing. So.
Okay.
I want to follow up on Jerome's comment because I think it's actually pretty important. I mean, the reason the shuttle failed and some of those other space transportation systems failed is, the goal at NASA at that point was more about jobs and employing people than it was about creating a commercially viable system. And I think that really speaks to the role of the government versus the role of private industry. The government's good at employing people and doing research and development, but they're not there to run a profit. Whereas you get people like Elon Musk, he's there to run a profitable business and get to Mars at the same time. And I think what is this sea change is the venture capital community doesn't have the patience to do a launch vehicle development. Somehow Kistler raised $400 million, but I don't think that will ever, of private equity, and I don't think that will be repeated. I think what you're seeing right now, we're in a unique time where we've, through the internet revolution, we have, handfuls of billionaires on the planet who all grew up, like all of us in this room did, dreaming of space, and now they have the ability to take their personal wealth and go invest in that. Elon's done it. I mean, he spent everything he had to get there, and he almost failed. Luckily, he made it. In Seattle, we also have Blue Origin, in addition to Vulcan, who are investing tremendous amounts of money. And I think there are other billionaires in the United States and around the world who are thinking about space endeavors. And it's those people that have the vision and the means and the dedication, because it's a decade-long commitment, not just a 18-month commitment. Those are the people that are going to build this basic infrastructure that's going to take us off-world. So I think that's the key.
Okay. Jay?
So real quick, so for us, this question is the heart of who we are, in alignment with everything that's been said, and more specifically with Chuck. It's affordability, and that's frequency and also predictability. And when you have that, then you, I think, begin to have one of the technologies that's necessary. And I will say, Letitia's point is very relevant. If this is going to be a business model, that quantity has a quality all its own. So just having one isn't going to do it.
Right. Okay, next question. The Space Frontier Foundation has taken the position that technology is no longer the primary barrier to cheap access to space, and that the number one barrier to catch is there is not a clear, proven market with a high enough flight rate to justify the large investment needed for a fully reusable launch vehicle. And if there was a large enough market that American private industry could build a fully launch vehicle that could provide cheap access to space. Comments?
So I'll take this one. I think for the market to become a high flight rate market, we need to drop the cost. And so this is why we're bringing new technology, microwave powered propulsion, that can really decrease the cost, as I was describing in my keynote, 100-fold compared to the great service provided by Jason on multi-manifest rockets, which today is the only service that you can use to go to space. And so I think we will see this high flight rates as we drop the cost. It's not going to happen the other way around. And so we have to invest in those technologies. We have to have this patience that Jason, I think, was highlighting, it was you, Jason, that this is, more of a 10-year type commitment. Well, in our case, we're probably 6 years away from market, 6 years time to market. That's probably more than a lot of your typical financial investors out there, but I think that investment is needed to reach the high flight rates.
Other comments?
I think it's kind of a chicken and egg problem of high volume and low cost, but I think I agree with you that low cost has to come first, and then you will get the big market. So how do we incentivize people to come up with new ideas, low cost ideas? Is the XPRIZE approach something that NASA can do and foment new ideas and new approaches that would allow us to choose among various entrepreneurs? Is that the way to go?
If there's going to be an XPRIZE for this, I think we'll want to enter it.
I guess my input would be, I think the technology is at hand to have a robust commercial market, but I think technology at the same time is what's going to be required to take us beyond where we are. I mean, I think if you think about the history of humanity, we've only been a spacefaring nation for, 50 years now? We got millennia to go. So clearly we're going to continue to advance and develop and do that, and it's going to turn into a very robust industry. One of the studies we did for NASA 10 years ago was when they were thinking about, they just lost the Columbia, they were looking at revisiting what should NASA do, where should we go. We did a big space transportation architecture study for them. And one of the key takeaways we had from that was maybe we should rethink how we do space. And one of the observations we had is, well, you should really go to a nodal architecture. It's just like the hub and spoke transportation system. We all take one mode of transportation to go to a hub, to transfer to another mode of transportation to go to a hub. And I think if you look at space, you can start to think of those nodes out there as low Earth orbit, maybe low lunar orbit, maybe geosynchronous orbit. You probably have a node around Mars, like on Phobos. And if you do that, then you can really focus your technology, because certain technologies like electrodynamic tethers work great from going through a couple of those point A to Bs, and people can focus the technology and we get better return on investment. And it's going to enable a lot of other new businesses in the process.
Yeah, I have an additional comment on this topic, which is that I have to say that I think small launchers, there are a couple of companies that are pursuing smaller chemical launchers, I think will actually play a role in bringing flight rates up, not just because it's lower payload, that's math, but in general having the ability, they're not bringing the cost down, but they're going to increase the possibility to launch as primary payload, and that's going to make some industry, like think about the medical research industry, and a lot of people have done investigation around protein crystal growth, in particular shuttle astronaut Larry DeLuca, and for them, knowing that you can now have a consistent and regular window of opportunity to launch will make a huge difference. And so some big pharma company could go and back some of those efforts. And so that's one example, but I think there are others. So I'm actually very excited by the fact that we have smaller chemical launchers that will soon come to market, because I think they have a key role to play as well.
Actually, I'll tag on that. Sorry, one last comment. I think that's a really important point, because technology is only part of the solution, and it really is the business, and that's what we found too. When we published a pricing list and a manifest list, having regular access to space was a huge driver for a lot of people. And right now, we are really an enclave under our own as far as business goes to enable their business. But once the price comes down or access to space improves, just the flight rate, That allows people to get on a regular cadence, and they can actually figure out how to use space as part of their business, and that will grow the broader pool and the market. So I think that's a very insightful point.
Jay?
So this one, the market doesn't concern me at all. I think it'll
Space payloads?
doesn't matter. I
Okay.
think the free market will figure it out.
Okay.
And what they could do with it to try and define it now or limit it now, really foolish. I saw this in a very small snapshot in my time at Beechcraft. Intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR, was traditionally limited to very large platforms, either satellite-based or significant systems that were big airplanes. And so therefore it was very expensive. So it was limited what the mission was. And the users were very limited because there were very few that could afford it. As the technology started getting smaller and you were able to put it on more affordable platforms, and we happen to have one in the King Air at Beechcraft, the next thing you knew, what they were flying missions for, you'd never dreamed of. And it exploded. And people were coming out of the woodwork saying, and we actually were getting calls say, I want ISR. Well, what are you trying to do? I don't know, but I gotta have some of that. And it was amazing. People were using it for fisheries protection. You know, now to fly pipelines in lieu of trucks. Mapping technology that everybody uses here. So much of that is flown in an ISR or some sort of reconnaissance platform. That market just exploded, and it was unlimited what people could dream up. And so this piece, that doesn't concern us at all.
Chuck?
I completely agree. In fact, I think that what will really accelerate technology investment to get to even further cost reductions is going to be the free market. And so it's creating a cycle of businesses that can generate profitable, that can be profitable, right? Implement anything. When that, and I think we're there. I think obviously, you know, Vulcan wouldn't be investing in companies like Black Sky and if we didn't think that they had a business case that closed, right? And I think we're going to see more and more and more of that, especially ideas coming from the generation that grew up with handhelds, you know, in their baby hands, right? They don't. I'm amazed at the way the very young, I guess the Generation Y or whatever, the way they think, they innovate, the way they create and think of ways to use things is very different than my generation. And I think those ideas are going to spawn new businesses that from or through space, and that's going to create a whole augmentation to the current economy that exists.
Any other comments? Next question. So, have you identified a financial tipping point or metric that once achieved indicates that cheap access to space has been achieved? Anybody?
I'd say we're there. I mean, you look at SpaceXs Manifest, they are the rocket to get on. You know, they've fundamentally changed how the entire launch market, you look at the launch market and who was there before SpaceX and who's there today, and it's pretty different. I mean, the Falcon 9 flew 5 years ago this year for the very first time, and now they have 50% of the commercial launch market. And they have the majority of the ISS supply market, and they're gonna just continue to expand, and I think people are playing catch up. So they've already transformed the market, and I think by using different business models, so they're creating a sea change. I mean, you look at the reaction of ULA, you look at the reaction of Arianespace, the whole market is pivoting to how do I keep up with SpaceX? How do I change and do that? And we're all gonna benefit from it because it's gonna drive competition, just what we talked about, it's gonna drive prices down. And other business models like Spaceflights and others to use rideshare is just gonna continue to provide benefits and create this robust space commerce.
Others?
Yeah, I would say that we reached that point. It costs the same price on the other end of the globe as sending your payload to orbit. I mean, if you're sending a kilogram up or on Earth, once you've achieved that parity, you're there, and I think we will get there.
Right.
And I think that's
All right, we
for
have
me
some
the tipping point.
disagreement, all right. So, come on, Jay, come, Jerome.
Well, I really celebrate Elon Musk and his success on the Falcon vehicles, but we're still talking about several thousand kilograms, several $1,000s per kilogram. I come at it from the space elevator, space colonization side of things. I'd like to see a lot of people going into space, homesteading on the moon or Mars and that sort of thing. You can't do that, several $1,000s a kilogram just to get to low Earth orbit. You got to reduce that by another order or two of magnitude. And I'm not sure we're on the right path.
Tipping point to get there, Jerome. What is the tipping point where you have that, you know you're getting that? How do you know it?
$100 a
Okay.
kilogram.
I think it's kind of a silly question, honestly. Because it's like, it would be like in 1982 asking, when will computers have to be fast enough where they'll be useful? And the reality is, if I agree with anybody, it would be Jason, which we are there now, cheap access to space, and that's just with one competitor.
So the kind of tipping point I would argue to push back on that would be called VisiCalc. That was the tipping point where they became useful for new applications opened up, and that was pre-1982.
Well, you can say it was the tipping point. Look in hindsight,
right?
But you could say, well, how about was the tipping point when kids started to learn how to program in BASIC on their TRS-80s in the 70s? That you created
point, somewhere in that area, right?
Maybe, or was it when the iPod came out? Was it when the cell phone came out? Because that's a handheld computer. Was it when, and what my point is that at every single juncture, as you created this virtuous cycle of technology, it just expanded more and more and more. And we look, as cool as we all thought computers were in, when Microsoft Office came out, or pick your sort of next big thing that, Microsoft Office, that changed the office environment for everybody.
Right.
Became a whole different, we interacted completely differently, no more inboxes, stuff like that. And so I agree with Jason that we're kind of there already.
Right. So you're on the virtuous cycle is a very key word. And I think that's what I heard out of Jason. Is virtuous. He thinks the virtuous cycle is starting, and he didn't use those words, but that's that virtuous cycle takes off.
And that's why this. I was earlier this week. I was on a panel, and I had the luxury of following a senator, U.S. senator, and he was kind of talking about how. Things seem to be adrift in the space business, and I said I actually completely disagree. I think this is one of the most exciting times to be in the space business, because we are in that inflection point. Where is it going to go? I don't know. It's going to be up to all these CEOs of all these startup companies that are raising money, because it's a wild west right now. It's really exciting.
So I think it started, but I think there's another one coming, and it's right around the corner. And that's when we start flying people, not just government employees, but passengers who are spending their own money. I know we
got that, right?
I understand, but they're still flying on government rockets and government space transportation systems. When they start flying on commercial space transportation systems, and it's not just to orbit, it's suborbital. I mean, when you start creating this broad user experience where people can training, and they can do a suborbital flight, and they can move up to an orbital flight, and they can stay on a destination, I think that's when things really start to accelerate.
So you open up a whole new market, and there's a virtuous cycle that starts there, right? It's driving.
Well, it's huge. I mean, somewhere, I don't know if you asked the question or someone made the comment, but what is that market that's going to really drive the next change? And I think it's people in space. I mean, there's only so many satellites you can put up there, and the satellites are getting smaller, so it's not doing a lot to change the space transportation industry.
Right.
What is the next thing that's really going to drive the change in the space transportation industry? And it's all of us wanting to go up there and being able to afford it. And what's going to happen, I mean, let's just take the suborbital. As an example, Virgin came out and says $200,000 a seat, and the next came out and says $100,000 a seat, and someone's going to say it's $50,000, and there's going to be a race, a little bit of a race to the bottom, but in theory, it's an elastic market. So as you go down, the number of flights go up. So that's going to fundamentally transform suborbital, and the same thing's going to happen in orbital. SpaceX will fly their Dragon, and then Boeing will fly theirs, and then there'll be a price war, and then someone else is going to come into the market with a better technology. Maybe it's Vulcan, with their Nubian Star Cruiser. But ultimately, we're driving the price down. we're driving the price down and we're driving the market up. It's what's elastic, what's really going to drive it. And to me, on everything we've looked at for 2 decades, all the studies out there, it's people.
Was Nubian Star Cruiser from the planet Vulcan? I don't know. So
I'm mixing my movies.
does Jerome or Laetitia want to respond to any of this, or we'll move on to the next question? It's up to you.
Well,
Or
I
Jay.
just say, everything that's been mentioned is from a market perspective, so perhaps from just an individual business perspective, the tipping point's real simple, it's profitability.
All right, well, next question. And this is the last one, and we'll open it up to the audience. So what does near-term success look like, and what's next?
I think Jay just answered that. It's profitability.
Completely agree. I mean, that was in my opening. You know, in fact, we call our vision NexSpace, because what's next is profitability. It is entrepreneurs building business plans that generate revenue, just like any other, just like a restaurant or any other business, and then they garner investors, and then they live the American dream. And then that is occurring now, and we are in that. That's that inflection point, and I think from here on out, it's just gonna take off.
I'll say that that's very true for a number of businesses, like, for example, Jason Businesses, which is a great business model. I love, by the way, the imaging as a service for companies in government that don't have their own satellites. And I think there are businesses that will monetize and get to revenue literally instantaneously. But I think we shouldn't forget that for radical innovation to happen, there are still efforts like microwave-powered propulsion, where cost and time to market is going to be much more significant. And so for those type of efforts that are trying to push radical decreases in the cost of access to space, the next success is described literally of the next milestone. So we just had a fantastic milestone proving ASP of 500 second flowing helium that was greater than chemical rocket. Our next success is to bring that out and show with hydrogen that we can be at 750 second, which is far beyond the level required for single stage to orbit. And I think we still have to define our next success as a technology. Although we could also say a financial raise would be an additional success, of course, because those technology efforts have to be financed. But so I think profitability definitely for more mature companies, but we still need to keep an eye on technological success as well.
Jay, Jerome? Anything? We're going to move on to questions from the audience. So please announce your name and then your question.
Al Globus. And you and I are both part of the Alliance for Space Development. One of the things, we have a proposal, a legislative proposal for a prize to incentivize vehicles. And that prize pays for reusable flights in a certain amount of time and so forth, with a payload of mass equivalent of 2 humans to 400 kilometers. Would that prize help you in your business? How would it have to be modified in order to do so?
You have to. I'm sorry. I'm not familiar with that legislative initiative. What exactly?
Okay,
What's the prize for?
The proposal is if you fly a reusable vehicle twice within a week to 400 kilometers with the equivalent of mass, you get $1 billion. If you're the second company to do it, you get 750. Then the same idea, only 10 times in 10 weeks, another billion. Another 750 million.
And this is a legislative to have appropriate $1 billion for a prize? I have to ask Josh what the likelihood of the appropriators doing that. But
this is Charles's idea.
Okay, I think
it's a good one. I think it's a good one.
I think I'll say this: a prize is always a great inducement to get to go do things. You know, my boss obviously was highly motivated to win the Ansari XPRIZE and did with his partners and stuff. But I think, man.
If you could get it passed,
Well,
whether you get it passed.
and then the question becomes, if you want to, you could have the debate, is that a good public policy? Is that a good use of $1 billion? Because that's real money, right? That becomes
But you
taxpayer money.
only pay it if you get the result.
And then
right?
who owns the result? Who owns that? The government pays $1 billion. Who owns the intellectual property
The
associated?
company, under the draft legislation, keeps all intellectual property and ownership of their assets. The government's trying to stimulate fully reusable launch vehicles in America.
I think a prize concept. I think a prize concept would be good. I think it'd be interesting to have a large prize like that. But what I would suggest doing is making the design, make the prize large enough that whoever wins it wins enough to retire, basically, and that becomes public domain. And that becomes owned by the government and becomes a public domain intellectual property in a sense. Because then I think you would truly spawn a revolution if that became not just secret sauce to one company, but then it became sort of.
So would Vulcan,
the taxpayers are paying for it.
Would Vulcan compete for it under those conditions that it became
I don't know.
public
I have to talk
domain?
to the boss on that.
Well,
one.
that would be important.
He just might.
If Paul Allen said, "I'll compete and give away this intellectual property if I won this prize," we can
Frankly,
change the draft legislation.
Frankly, that's an interesting question. That in fact, I was unaware of this thing, and if you'd like to have that conversation we'd be very interested
Would love to
in
have
taking
that
part in it.
conversation.
And please make sure the time horizon includes our projected path to orbit. So 2021,
So
2022 would be great. We're in.
It's basically who gets there first with a fully reusable launch.
We can still be first. Just make sure it doesn't expire before the.
Yeah.
I'm confident.
No
I'd like to point
expiration.
out it's for the equivalent of two humans, mass equivalent. That's considerably more than 200 kilograms. So what actually I'm aiming for is somebody to say, oh, that's a great idea to reduce the mass requirements for me to compete.
Yes, and the issue you're putting there is you're putting a human rating condition in there, and so I would argue that if the system can later be human rated, why not start with a simple payload and up to 200 kilogram, for example?
195, just in case.
I guess I'm kind of blunt sometimes. I don't think it's a good idea. I think you're better off fully funding the NASA crew program right now because it's been cut and give them $1 billion. Because once these vehicles are up there, people use them. I went to Gwen Shotwell 5 years ago and says, when can I buy seats on a SpaceX Dragon? So I'll sell the excess capacity as soon as it's available. So we should figure out, how do you stimulate the market? You need a destination. The ISS is a destination. So let's just do what we're doing, and I think it's going to go crazy from there.
Okay, next, any other comments? Next question, and your name and then your question.
Good afternoon, Earl White. So Ash Carter is trying to leverage Silicon Valley. What would encourage the NewSpace part of Silicon Valley to work with the DoD? Would it be things like access to facilities?
I guess this is a DoD question, so I'll have to. Are you basically asking how could it work better together? How could the DoD leverage NewSpace, the Silicon Valley NewSpace? I think it kind of gets to what we've talked about earlier about sort of opening up some of these ideas and these markets to DoD business. I think a lot of these small startup companies, this is my impression, having met many of them, they're sort of, it's daunting to them to even think about approaching different services and agencies within, let's just say the national security apparatus in general. And it's daunting for good reason. Immediately they think, oh, I've got to have my man in Washington. Oh, I've got, I have to sift through tens of thousands of pages of FARs and DFARs and all kinds of rules and regulations and compliance with, and that is antithetical to the sort of Silicon Valley way of innovation. And so I think what excited me leaving government and coming to work for Paul doing this stuff is the fact that it's the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and it's really exciting. And I think that through that letter that I talked about before and other things, I think it's going to take some education and some nudging. I'm not as cynical, even though I have an extra decade maybe on Jason. I'm not as cynical as Jason, but I do think that we can educate, and I think we can make some great progress in that area.
So let me say one thing real quick on that, in addition to what Chuck had. There's a fundamental disconnect that exists in the way that the government wants to look at procuring its services to what the private sector needs to do to be able to provide those in the economical way that the government's seeking. They are very adverse to multi-year contracts. So, and the bigger the contract, the more they adverse to it because it gets the political awareness. So to ask the private sector to help solve a problem will typically require an investment, and you want to amortize that investment over some reasonable period. It's why we do what we do. And when you're adverse to letting multi-year contracts for something, you're immediately disconnecting because someone either has to, one, waive it off, or two, put all their NRE in year one, which then defeats the purpose of why you're trying to find a commercial contract. So fundamentally, at the OMB level, there needs to be a discussion about a willingness to look at multi-year contracts in conjunction with this whole desire to outsource.
Can I follow up just for a second?
Please do.
So when Ash Carter has set up this office at Silicon Valley, is it something that this panel of, I was surprised at the cynicism, I heard about dealing with the government, but is it something that you would work with and deal with?
I guess I'm the cynic, so you're directing that at me. I think we would sell services to the government. I guess I echo what Jay says. The problem with the government is they're schizophrenic. They have budget cycles that change. They're so politically driven. They're not profit driven, and that's just a process of the institution. There's some good meaning people there, but at the same time, I think it really does come down to profit. So what the government needs to do is create a market. That's what, again, going back to what they did with cargo logistics, crude logistics, create a market, and the market will turn to it. Venture capitalists, not only do they like profit, they like a lot of profit. And you have to show them that or you're not going to get their money. So if the government wants to work with the Silicon Valley VCs, help solve that problem.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. Your name and then your question.
Doug Messier from Parabolic Arc. This is a question for Chuck. You guys went through Dynetics, I think, and SpaceX and Orbital in terms of the rocket. And it seems like perhaps you've repeated the mistake of Spaceship Two, where they built the aircraft or spacecraft and then put the rocket, assumed they could do a rocket. And I'm wondering, was that a mistake you guys made?
No.
No? Okay.
What a mistake? I'm sorry.
Well, you've got a giant plane, an aircraft under construction, but
Yeah.
you don't know what rocket you're going to use.
We don't? Are you telling me that, or?
Do you?
Yes, we do.
You do?
Mhm.
Okay.
But we're not good. This is what I was alluding to earlier. We'll make some announcements in the fall
Okay.
about our strategy going forward.
Yeah, I'm just wondering why you didn't nail down the rocket first and then build a plane to do it. Okay.
All right. Come on, next question. This gentleman over here.
Hi, Nicholas Anthony. I'm wondering, so from the vibes I'm getting from this conference is that this market is going to exist very shortly, and access to space itself will be very cheap, very soon. What sort of time frame, as a personal entrepreneur, say in the next 10 years, how soon, I don't know if this question has an answer, how soon do you think access to beyond space, just low Earth orbit, will be a reality? 10 years, 15?
You mean beyond Leo? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So I think you're referring more to efforts like the efforts of Chang Diaz, which is now going through, I think, a 3-year test program funded by NASA to run his engine, his Vasimir engine. But so we're still quite far away, I think he would reckon himself, from in-space propulsion being able to take something from LEO all the way to further planetary bodies. So I think when you say very soon, I would just slightly correct us, and I love your optimism, but I think that, 10 years in space is not that of a lengthy time period, and so quite a couple of years. But look up and the recent news on the efforts of Ad Astra, because they're definitely doing good progress in that field.
Go ahead, Jason.
I think my comment would be change, takes a long time, but also happens faster than you think. Just to give you some anecdotes, I remember sitting in a conference room at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center, and this is circa 2000, and we were talking about what happens after the shuttle. And as a small entrepreneurial company, we were talking about space tourism, and half the people in the room from NASA stood up and said, "Not in my lifetime will I ever see space tourism." And I think 6 months later, Dennis Tito went up to the International Space Station. And it was 2003, and this is before Columbia went down, and we had a contract with, again, NASA Marshall to do cargo logistics at the International Space Station. And the attitude at the time was, not in my lifetime will there be commercial cargo logistics to the International Space Station. And here we are 10 years later, we flew the first flights up there. And so I think a lot can happen in a decade. And again, it's not just Elon doing it, but I would not put it past Elon to send someone beyond low Earth orbit in the next 5 years, if he has the capital and the ability to do that. I don't think he's the only one thinking about that. So I think change is going to come very fast. I don't think we can predict it. But as far as we're seeing an acceleration at the rate of change, and I think it has directly to do with the amount of commercial money that's going into it. But again, it's wealthy individual money, and God bless them, because without it, we wouldn't be seeing the change that we have right now.
Yeah. So I think to say that Space Adventures would say they're already doing that they're signing up customers to take a trip around the moon. Did you have something different in mind? What were you really?
Well, I guess the idea was, so right now, cheap access to space, like from 0 to 200, 300 kilometers, is now. Like, it's already within the next 3-4 years. What my question was is, when will we reach this sort of level of really, really cheap access to beyond LEO?
Okay, so it's more a technology question and much lower cost.
Yeah, I would say that.
Okay.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't know if it has an exact answer. Like he said, it could be,
Right.
5 years, 10 years. I was just, you guys are the cream of the crop right now, so
Right.
maybe your ideas would be cool.
I'll answer for Laetitia on this. I think the next big one will be when we abandon chemical, and that'll be, but and thank God we have people working on that, because that's the business side of what we're doing is building profitable businesses and all that is one thing, but then usually there's that technology pivot that then ushers in a whole new age, and I think it will be. Whether it's Escape Dynamics or another company, it will be when we abandon the chemical propulsion, or we've perfected it.
Great. Next question. Come on, you have a... Jason, go.
Well, I didn't have an answer. I was going to be controversial. I actually think beam propulsion has a great future, and there's great applications. But I actually think, at least for Earth to orbit, it's going to be a long time before we get past that. And I actually think it's going to be reusability that fundamentally changes that. Because you can get a fully reusable system, two-stage, to low Earth orbit, using chemical propulsion. And if you really look at airliners over the last 60 years, they kind of plateaued out at a technology because that's where the market drove them to, and they're doing incremental improvements. And I think with the existing technology they have, and I think that's what we're going to see, is we're going to, instead of going to new propulsion systems, we're going to take the ones we have and figure out how to operate them better and more reliably. And ultimately, we will start flying to space, with chemical propulsion. We'll go from vertical takeoff to horizontal takeoff. I think it's really going to leverage the benefits that suborbital companies are focused on. So I don't disagree, but I think that the technology trend is going to be slightly different.
Okay. Well, we're about out of time. I'd like to start on Jerome's side and come back this way and give everybody 30 seconds, one last thought to leave with the audience. So, what if you want to leave them with one thought, what would you leave them with?
We're working on one small part of low-cost access to space, and that is going to different orbits from your. And we hope to have that happening fairly soon, where we're going to be taking the Surrey feathercraft from ISS to Sun Synchronous, and we hope to go from there. And that'll open up all kinds of orbits in LEO from any starting point that you want, as a secondary payload or from the ISS or whatever.
So I think if we look at where the market's going in general, to get there, this particular topic is fundamental. I think it was one of the questions. So I think it's very important. There are many different ways to describe it and define it and get there. We as XCOR are certainly doing our part in the more frequent, predictable, capable, and affordable, but so are many others in different ways. But I think we need to remember this is fundamental piece of getting where this whole market is going.
I'll go in an entirely different direction. We look forward to hosting you next year in Seattle at this conference.
I think I'll rebound on something Chuck said earlier. I think I would encourage everyone to think about cost of access to space by encompassing the cost to the actual customers in terms of suddenly being stolen a launch opportunity because the rocket is no longer going. And too often we just focus on the price tag, and there is so much more that comes with it.
Chuck, you get the last word.
Oh, that's dangerous. I think what I would say, my parting thoughts from the panel, and thank you very much for running this. I think you did an outstanding job. So thank you for that. I think that what's next for space is going to be, and I think this is something that we're all working on in different ways, in different phases of sort of a business cycle, is profitability, and building real businesses that generate real revenue, a real income for the business owners. And I think we're there, and it's gonna blow wide open, and it's the most exciting time ever to be in the space business.
A hand of applause for the audience, for the panel, please. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to Vulcan Aerospace for sponsoring this, and it's now lunchtime.